Hey, everybody, welcome in. It's the Wrestling Mat. It's a very, God, special doesn't even sound like the right word for considering our subject matter today, but I welcome in the Mat members who are with us here today for this very special bonus content, I guess you would call. I feel like I should say this is a Wrestling Mat special report. We are talking about the Mr. McMahon documentary today. We're going to be doing the first 3 episodes of the Mr. McMahon documentary. They all got, titles: Junior, Heat, and Screwjob. So for today's episode, for the Mat members, and I thank you all for the support, that allows us to create some bonus content like this for you. We'll be talking about those first 3 episodes. Happy to take your questions. I'll give you my comments and my thoughts on everything. As we get into this, my initial thoughts on the documentary, as I started to take them in episode by episode, was I know all this stuff, or I know almost all this stuff. Not that I paid less attention, but I would hear stuff. I'm going, oh, what are we going to uncover? What are we going to uncover? What's going to come out of this? Some things came out. I think Vince's quotes, the way he spoke, more than anything else, his demeanor, his lack of remorse. The interviews that were conducted with Vince specifically all happened before everything came out. And as it was noted in the documentary, he canceled final interviews. I'm not going to tell you that Vince would have known or should have known that there was a chance things could come out or anything like that. But I think it was telling that Bill Simmons and Ringer, who, produced this thing, and David Shoemaker, who was part of it, said it was very odd dealing with Vince. And he had, people there reminding him of the past. And while he was open to doing it and wanting to tell his story, like he didn't understand how that would work. And if you listen to that and hear that, it's like, well, how would he not know it works? Like, doesn't he understand what the documentary is? And then I went, oh, use Vince brain here, which, believe me, we learned way too much about in this 6-part documentary series. Vince brain is, I get to control everything. Vince brain is not retrospective. When they were doing interviews, I believe, for The Last Ride, if I believe this is correct, The Last Ride was done in-house. The Last Ride was a WWE documentary. As far as I know, the guy who runs the docs, the VP of documentaries, did those interviews because it was Vince. Vince does not like to talk about the past. Vince does not like to talk about himself. When they're telling your story, that's what you have to do. And in the probably saddest, simplest way, hearing that, he didn't know what this would entail and he had to be reminded of stuff of the past. And I was like, oh, that does sound like Vince. That sounds like every story I've heard about the mentality of Vince. It's very much, well, wait, what do you mean we're doing it a different way? Where he's talking about Sable and people correct him. And one of the people off camera correcting him is Paul Heyman. So here's what you're not going to hear. As far as I know, Paul Heyman was interviewed for this in the building I worked in. I could be wrong about that, but he came in. It might have been for some other doc. But he was in, and he was in the same, more than a few people came in that building. And they shot a lot of stuff there. Netflix shot stuff there for Vince. WWE, I sat in that very same room. It's called Squash Alley. Originally, there was not a ring in there. They put a ring in there for Vince. and it just remained in there. I shot episodes of This Is Awesome there. Things we did for the bump were in there. There was an up, down, down WWE 2K ratings reveal there. So it did become a backdrop for documentary. So I know like Heyman had come through the building, but I knew Vince was there. I had heard there might have been crossover or something like that, and it didn't look like, based on what we saw in the documentary, that where Vince had his interviews done in that ring at the digital building, it didn't look like him and Heyman were in the same place. Unless they tried, and believe me, you can make things look like whatever you want, wherever you want them to be, and people have no idea. But it looked like Heyman's was done somewhere else. But Vince was in that room. And I'm not surprised that he had his people with him. And I wasn't surprised to hear, well, you know, he would push the time back and we would just be waiting around for ETAs. Ask anybody who was on the writing team with Vince. That was life. That's why that job under Vince did not have a long shelf life. People would hang in there for a year, maybe, and move on or get fired or what. It was too chaotic. It was too all over the place. It wasn't. Vince gets a lot of credit for being a wrestling genius. To me, he was, for a time, a wrestling genius. He will go down as the greatest promoter of all time. And that's all I'm going to speak on as it relates to him as a wrestling pro. I'm just limiting it to him being a promoter. I'm not talking about the human being or things he did along the way. But as time went on, and I had heard this, that when WWE went public, Vince's mindset changed. Now, WWE went public, as we know, not that long after the purchase of WCW. And that was the whole thing with Austin's last match. We don't want to tell anybody because we're going public and all. And not surprisingly, creative started to go downhill. But I was told by someone who had been there for quite some time, who had worked under multiple eras of the company and under Vince, he started, all the micromanaging really began when the company went public because he felt that it fell on him. And I can respect that. I can respect that thought process as a businessman. Do I completely believe it? No. I think he did want to put his fist down on things. I think with more shows, because then at that point you're a couple of years into Raw and SmackDown, 4 hours of television a week, Heat's 5. Obviously, it would grow. And they had the brand split and all that stuff, but he's very much still in it as obviously the owner of the company and the booker of the company and all of the hats he wore, but he was also a performer. Nerdy Dude says, would you say Vince was too stuck in the past when it came to creative? Stuck in the past, I don't know if that's how I would explain it. Stuck in the past, I would say his verbiage because of his age. Like I would get the Raw and SmackDown scripts, right? And people's promos were written out. And as I've said, depending on where you are on the card and seniority and all that stuff, you could, in your relationship with Vince, you could change words. But I could read verbiage. I could read things that Michael Cole was the director to say, how he was supposed to promote a match. And you could hear it in Vince's voice. But then to make wrestlers who are 40, 50 years younger than Vince read those words. Suffer and succotash. Everybody knows that one. You know it didn't make sense. You know it didn't come from them. Characters have a way to speak. I'm not saying they all figure that out on their own. I do think people like Paul Heyman have been able to help a lot of people find their character. I do think people like Dusty Rhodes were able to do that. I do think Kevin Sullivan did that for a time. I think Pat Patterson, who obviously was a big part of this documentary at times, helped people figure that out. I think William Regal has done that. And I think Vince can do that. But as Vince got older, he's going to more, it's not necessarily being in the past, it's more just losing touch with reality. And wrestling evolves with the times. There's still a lot of basics in pro wrestling that will always be there. I actually enjoyed, as I kind of link it in here to the episodes, I liked Vince explaining wrestling. It's one of the first things they showed in the whole doc. Him explaining what wrestling really comes down to. It's 1 versus 2, and they battle, and they have a personal issue. It's personal. They're fighting over a championship. Who's the better man? Who's the better woman? You get a third part in there. You got a big finish. You know, that's what wrestling is. And obviously that varies. Vince as a booker, though, because Dennis said, are we sure he was, as in the greatest promoter of all time? His best moments tended to come from being a great businessman, whereas the great booking often came from the stars he got elsewhere in the 80s and promoted in almost the same. That's fair. But I am a believer of, and then it didn't always work this way. They didn't get them all right. And that is something I think you got to think about. There's a lot of smart wrestling people who got a lot of stuff wrong. Dusty Rhodes is absolutely in that conversation. Bill Watts is in that conversation. Vince McMahon is in that conversation. Vince Russo's in that conversation. Eric Bischoff's in that conversation. I think Bischoff and Russo get more of it because they had a lot more failures than Vince did after they left Vince. And their companies closed or they were out of a job multiple times. Bischoff got fired from WCW. Bischoff went to TNA and didn't help the brand. Russo went to WCW. Really didn't work out. Went to TNA. A little success here and there, but didn't really work out. Vince had a lot of misses too. But Vince was a better businessman. And I actually do think that business and promotion are all tied together. I think a great promoter knows business. Vince just looked at it in a bigger way. Did Hulk Hogan get created in the AWA? Yes, but I think Vince took it to another level. And I think when you look at it, it's for a much longer period of time. And he branded that. And I will say, to a fault, that branding is a big part of Vince's philosophy in pro wrestling. Make it your own. Make people remember. Chris Jericho told a story a few years back when he was wrestling Kenny Omega in New Japan. And he kept saying Alpha versus Omega, Alpha versus Omega, Alpha versus Omega. He was the Alpha. Kenny Omega is the Omega. And he said the reason he did that is he learned that from Vince. They branded the match, Alpha versus Omega. It worked. It was a big deal. It's why WrestleMania in Dallas, the greatest WrestleMania, whatever, blah, 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 title versus title, winner take all. I had a paragraph to read every time I mentioned Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns. That was branding. It was too much branding. The most stupendous WrestleMania ever. Why? Because Pat McAfee said it and Vince liked the word. Vince loved getting the most out of the English language. He did. He didn't like, and you know the stories of it's not a hospital. It's a local medical facility. You know, Michael Cole once called blood red viscous liquid. It's not a belt. It's a title. A belt holds up your pants. Like all that stuff, which was mind-numbing and unnecessary. Couldn't use wrestling for a while. That was a thing. When Vince was gone, the first thing I started saying again was pro wrestling. And then there was a heads up from Kevin Dunn. You know, we still do sports entertainment here. Not to me, but to everybody, because it got loose. But Vince going back as a promoter, no, I do think he's the greatest promoter of all time, because promoting, I think he expanded the role and the scope of what a promoter should be looking to do. Promoter, to me, is not necessarily just about booking. As Dennis, you mentioned, his best moments tended to come from being a great businessman, whereas great booking often came from the stars. Booking is not often, it's not necessarily about the promoter. A promoter doesn't necessarily have to be the booker. There have been promoters who have a booker that they trust or on a committee. Vince was all of those things. And, you know, the stories of him and Bruce and Pat sitting around the pool and writing down stories for months ahead of time. But it was different back then. And that's something that I think gets overlooked. In a way, it was easier to book wrestling in the 80s and 90s for two reasons. Number one, there wasn't as much to watch. There wasn't as much going on. People didn't have these. So I throw mine on the floor. And number two, there wasn't as much TV. There wasn't as much content to make. If you're going to go to Hershey, Pennsylvania, and shoot 5-6 episodes of Wrestling Challenge or All-Star Wrestling or Superstars or whatever, there's not a lot of story in them. There's some. You know, they would run squash, interviews in between, vignettes, whatever, and then there might be a big main event. But they were booking for 4 pay-per-views a year, 5 when they added King of the Ring in 1993. You could book that more long-term, and other than an injury or people leaving the business or firings or whatever, that's what it was. And you kind of had to stick to your booking because you would sit down at Gorilla and go, okay, we're doing 5 or 6 episodes. We're going with this. We have a pay-per-view at the corner. Hey, we might have a Saturday night's main event. We're going to load that up a little bit more. We're going to make that a bigger deal. But everything was about the house shows. Like, there wasn't this, like, TV was squash matches for the most part. Those syndicated shows were squash matches for the most part. The house shows, you got everybody facing each other. Not much happened at those, but that was their bread and butter. They weren't making, the money was coming from ticket sales. That was a huge part of the business. Way bigger than it is now. Now it's media rights. Media rights gets everybody paid. So Vince back then, with the booking committee and who he had, yeah, it was his final say, but it wasn't, you know, he's talking to Pat, he's talking to Bruce. Later on, it would be Cornette. Obviously, Russo got involved, and J.J. Dillon and Jerry Jarrett had a hand, and whatever you want to believe in that stuff. But that was once TV happened, and even though they were taping Raws and stuff like that, that changed the business. And then they had In Your Houses, and now it's every month. And now Raw goes from 1 hour to 2 hours. Now, I still think Vince was doing a good job. And obviously he had to, as they did discuss here a bit, and that's later on, they had to change how they did things. But in the beginning, and I did enjoy the stories that I think, if you dig around, these do already exist out there. I like the idea of finding out how Vince moved up in the world within his father's company, going to Maine and the promotion he did there, and seeing him as an announcer for the first time, and seeing him on the outside of the ring looking out. I thought was he's doing this with the people behind him and the wrestlers behind him. I like seeing the different perspectives of that. It was interesting seeing him kind of find his footing. And Vince, as we know, was not, and they even addressed this, Vince didn't know the wrestling moves. Vince called what he saw. And that became the standard by which everybody had to follow, and still kind of does follow, although it's obviously gotten a little bit easier with Vince not in your ear anymore. But that changed. What a maneuver. Exactly, Dennis. But that's what it was, telling the stories. And I will tell you, I get that. When I was doing the job, when I was learning, when I was getting my chance to do some commentary as a color commentator, but also as a play-by-play commentator at Level Up, it wasn't about the moves, and I knew that. It was telling a story, but then also, because it's Level Up and there aren't a lot of stories with these characters, how do we interweave in what's going on in Raw and SmackDown? All right, we're watching Ren Sinclair against Wendy Chu, and they're going at it. And obviously, I know they're both involved in stuff now. You might touch on their story and you go, and these two women, I'm sure they aspire to be part of SummerSlam, and we're going to see that this Saturday when Bianca Belair takes on Io Sky for the WWE Women's Championship, just to get that in there. And that, think back to the NWO days. How much did they talk about the NWO when Ming is facing Steve McMichael? When Rey Mysterio is going up against Psychosis? Well, the NWO and Hogan, that's, you promote to the bigger things, which is still smart to do in wrestling. You promote your top stars. You sprinkle them throughout the show. You sprinkle the promotion throughout the show, even if they're not on. That's the bread and butter. But Vince started, as you can tell, to figure out not only how to move up in his own father's company, but how he wanted to do things. I did find that interesting. And then you think about the hypocrisy of Vince, because it comes out in this episode, and then it comes out in the second episode. I'll answer some of your questions, though, here. Brian says, man, some of Vince's commentary on Raw is out of control. Going back and watching old episodes, he really does have a bombastic and flamboyant diction, only riddle suitable for the wrestling business. Like, he couldn't get away with that in any other product. And no, and you know what? Not because it's inappropriate, as you're saying, just that it's so unorthodox. If you were not sure, if you were watching a scripted show, just listen to Vince. That's a great point, Brian. There have been play-by-play people in sports who have had personality, who have put more into it. Howard Cosell, famously on Monday Night Football. Obviously, you had, John Madden as the color commentator and Pat Summerall, and there was a little bit more to that. They wanted, by the way, John Madden to call wrestling. That I'm surprised they didn't touch on that, but I know that's been touched on in other things. They wanted John Madden. John Madden would have been great at doing that. But Vince calling it, even Heenan and Gorilla. I liked Gorilla talking about body parts that I didn't know existed. I liked that, he would bring up the solar plexus. But Gorilla was also over the top as a commentator, and Vince was. But that's telling the story. He's the ring man. I tell people this all the time because I went through it. If you want to know where stories are supposed to be going, you're always going to get hints on commentary. And we saw that throughout the doc of Vince sitting at Gorilla, and I know we'll get to this in the second part of this series that we're going to do here on the wrestling mat. Vince feeding JBL lines about Shane going up to the top of the cell. And Vince kept doing it. It's a lot. But that's Vince. Tell stories, tell stories, tell stories, tell stories. Not what is the move, why is the move happening? What kind of pain are they in? What is this going to do? What does it mean for the story? I get that. The more I listen to wrestling commentary, the more I realize it is the right way to do it. Because I know for years people complained, they don't call the moves, they don't call the moves, they don't call. We're not watching a sport. And think about if you watch any sport, okay? I'll just take the NFL because it's on later tonight. You got the Giants and the Cowboys. It's a long, storied rivalry. And they'll talk all about how the teams have been playing. The Giants, and they have a great rookie wide receiver, and man, he lifted them up last week. But the Cowboys, man, they're really getting off to a slow start, and they almost had a comeback last week against the Baltimore Ravens. What are they doing? They're telling you the story of why the Giants and the Cowboys matter tonight. You're going to be watching it. And then in between the plays, what do? They analyze why it happened. Kirk Herbstreit and Al Michaels be on the game tonight, and Al Michaels will call the play. There's a toss out to the right, and there goes Ezekiel Elliott for 4 yards. Kirk, what happened on that play? And then Kirk Herbstreit will tell you, well, you see, they kicked out the right tackle over here, and then the wide receiver stayed in to block, and that was able to spring Ezekiel Elliott forward for 4 yards. And we talked to the coaches this week, and they said, we need to do a better job blocking for our running back. That's the same thing as me going, Stone Cold Steve Austin right now, he's got to have eyes in the back of his head because the last 3 times he's been out there, he's been attacked by the corporation. He's got to have a game plan to figure out how to stop them while focusing on The Undertaker here tonight. Well, that's true, and Undertaker's really going to work to him in the court. It's all still telling stories. I think I said this here recently. When I worked at NFL Films as an intern, and we had broadcast boot camp, and they had the producers from the major networks come in, and they had broadcasters come in, and there's something called the diner menu. And that, for football, is basically a stat pack, height, weight, college, whatever, achievements of every player on the team. Every single player. 53-man roster, and you flip it. Here's offense, here's defense, and special teams. You flip it, here's the other team, whatever. Not to get you through the game, because the action should carry you. That was, it's 30-3 in the third quarter. We got to make this thing interesting because we're still selling a TV product. Stephanie McMahon recently had, in the last couple of years, talked about how, we have the advantage of creating our own buzzer beaters. It's hard to replicate the authentic, organic nature of a buzzer beater or a big putt or a goal at the, whatever. But in wrestling, you can create those stories. So I do agree with the philosophy of telling stories on commentary. Vince went way over the top. I enjoyed Vince as a play-by-play commentator. I don't think Vince would work now. I think he would come off goofy. I think Michael Cole has found where you need to be as a commentator. But then I'll get some years in here. Dennis probably started pretty much his co-production, and those producers have at least a handful of narrative they plan on hitting depending on how the game plays out. Yes, and that's just preparing. That's it. That's just preparing for the broadcast. Sometimes you don't need to use all your prep. Sometimes you do. Sometimes it plays out in front of you and the story's right there. Think about last year. Give you another example. Aaron Rodgers tears his Achilles on the first drive of the year for the New York Jets after Hard Knocks, after all that hype. Here come the Jets. They finally have a quarterback. That's the story that they were telling going into the game. That changed. And it became a much different, dramatic, An unfortunate story for not only the New York Jets and their fans, but for the NFL and anybody that was going to broadcast the game. It's not as big of a deal if Aaron Rodgers, it's not as big of a deal if a star goes down, at least not early in the season. If they're in contention and there's a great story, Joe Flacco last year at the Cleveland Browns, a great example. He got him in the playoffs. The dude seemed to be out of it. WWE and wrestling as a whole can always manufacture those moments. You can always tell those stories. Vince was good about that. But as we move on, you know, the death of the territories. And Vince saying, well, it's business, and I did what I had to do, and I went and grabbed these people, and then I went and promoted in those areas, and he broke the handshake agreement. I don't have a problem with that because wrestling was going to go there anyway. He just did it first. But the hypocrisy is the handshake stuff because Vince had used handshake agreements. So it was, you could, like, he couldn't even hide the double standard of that. In the second episode, they talk, you know, well, they were stealing our talent. No, they weren't. You were pissed that they signed Hogan. That whole story gets told of, you know, they're going to flip from Hogan to Warrior. And then that doesn't work, so they go back to Hogan. But they're doing so with like a war backed behind it. And let's go with the stereotypical route. And Iran, we hate Iran, so we'll make Sergeant Slaughter and Iraqi sympathizers and Hulk's the great American. And they end up going back to Hulk. And at WrestleMania 8, what'd they do? Well, it could be Hulk's. It's in the promotion. It's a double main event in what could be Hulk Hogan's final match. Then he main events. And then Warrior comes back. And then at WrestleMania 9, Hogan comes back. And what happens? He ends up in the main event of WrestleMania 9. And then he's gone. And Vince is pissed he leaves. Even though Vince took Hulk Hogan from a territory, from Memphis with Randy Savage. He took Junkyard, and that's fine. Go get paid. Go get your people. I've talked about this recently. I hope there are bidding wars for wrestlers across multiple companies now because that's where we're at. AEW has brought financial competitiveness to the game. It's getting people paid. But to then bitch and complain that they took Hogan and they took Savage and they took Hall and Nash, well, pay them. Fucking pay them. If you couldn't keep them, tough shit. It's so hypocritical. Like, it's so obviously hypocritical. That's not fair. No, it's not fair to you. Vince, when backed into a corner, how many times do you see it through the documentary Phil Donahue show with the steroid trial and the Ring Boys and all that stuff? The Armin Katayan interview, the Bob Costas interview. He's literally just talking to someone and he can't handle himself. He's getting in Costas' face. He's knocking Armin Katayan's papers out of his hands. He's squirming all over the place on Phil Donahue. Because he couldn't control the situation. He couldn't handle it. And when that happens, he lashes out. He talks through that about how he could feel himself getting, like, that's not a stable human being. I will say, in all seriousness, as much as I'm going to knock him, and fairly so, the stories that he told about being beaten by his stepfather, indicating that he was sexually abused by his mother, not meeting his father until he was 12, and then saying, I pushed all that stuff behind me. That man has mental health issues. That man has always had mental health issues. And it is a shame that there weren't ways to help with that. And I know that mental health has become way more important in probably the last 5 to 10 years than it's ever been before. And there are more ways to help with that. and you can go to therapy and you can take medication. You can have conversations you need to have, and it's not a macho thing versus a man, woman thing. Like, but it's very clear Vince just was like, nope, got to handle it. That's life. And that permeated into everything else he did in business and his own family. And we're going to get to the family stuff in the second part of this, but man, you could see it. His need to be appreciated by his dad and loved, which then is something that Shane deals with later on. Dennis says, I don't even know if he expects it. He just tries to see if people will fall for it and grabs the most convenient argument at hand. It's why he's always seemed to treat people better, that left him better. Yeah, there is something to Vince where he appreciates you combating him. I said this all the time, and I hope this has changed. The only time you're going to piss off people who are in the wrestling business in a position like Vince or Bruce or anybody is if you mess with their show. If you question what's going on. And by that, I mean, you could get in trouble with the law. But if you make your shot and it doesn't mess with the booking, if you're a moneymaker for the company, it got overlooked. If you're in a position where they need you, it gets overlooked. Happened with the Usos when they got in trouble. Happened with Jack Swagger before WrestleMania when he wrestled Del Rio. Now, we don't know if there were fines or anything like that, but they kept him going. We also don't want to mess with our plans. And I'm not saying everybody needs to be definitely punished. And, of course, it's, you see where legal proceedings take you. But if you mess with the show, you question the show, show, then you're ostracized. Then you're in trouble. I know it happens in sports as well. People get a second chance if they're good. But God, that is such a thing in wrestling. As long as you don't mess with the show, usually stick around. I'm hoping that gets pushed out more. You think about the stuff that they talked about with Pat Patterson and Tony Atlas. And I'll say this about Tony Atlas. I know what he said. Tony Atlas is a great example of the fact that documentary did not have a reliable narrator. And more often than not, wrestling documentaries do not have reliable narrators. Everybody's working. When in doubt, they're working. Even when they're not supposed to be working, they're working. That's Hogan. Hogan was promoting himself in insane and ridiculous ways for his entire life. I caught him in a lie on the bump once. It's one of my favorite things I've ever done in my career because he looked like a fucking idiot, because he is. Because not enough people called him on his shit. And people would sit down for these documentaries and spurt out the same bullshit and crap and tell the same stories. And that happened all throughout this thing. And I agree with Dennis. Even when they don't know that they're working, they might have worked themselves into believing it. Yeah, sometimes that stuff just becomes true in their head. They've repeated it enough times. That's why it baffles me when people get mad about Tony Khan going, I think Edge is on one of the greatest runs of his career. Hulk Hogan said he tore every muscle in his body, slamming Andre the Giant. He didn't know if Andre was going to do business. I was promoting a fake thing. It's a tall tale because it's wrestling. Tony Khan's doing like that much of that in comparison. It's none of it's real. Go over the top. Undertaker's not 7 feet tall. Kane has lifts in his shoes that are that big. Adam Cole's not 6'1". Shawn Michaels is not 6'1". But it's promoted as such. some of those yardages at driving ranges are for entertainment purposes only. Who cares? Anthony Hopkins is not actually a cannibal, but they made movies about that. And then he went and did other movies. The Hogan stuff with Vince is hilarious because it's Vince. Hogan says, I just did everything Vince said. I just did everything Vince said. Even if I wasn't sure, I didn't agree with it, I just did it. Like blindly. He wants to go do movies. Vince goes, I'll write one. And they write a terrible movie, which allegedly may have had a lot of involved in that hotel room as they were writing that movie to keep themselves awake for a few days. But Vince didn't want to lose Hulk, so he's like, I'll write the movie. They so often, Vince, the company, you stay under here. We're keeping you under our thumb. I made you. Well, perhaps you had a hand in that. But it doesn't mean you get to control me for the rest of my life. That's like wrestling trainers who go, well, you still owe me 10% of your bookings. No, you don't. I don't know teachers part of my salary because they taught me something. They're doing their jobs. I paid you for wrestling training. You don't get to control as an independent contractor everything I do. But Vince, they did that. And I know they paid well. I get that. Hey, I got paid there. I got paid as an employee, though. That's a whole different story. The heat with Hogan was kind of funny because they admit earlier, like, we thought he started to die down in terms of his entertainment value, in terms of how people were liking him. And then he gets pissed that he leaves and goes to WCW. So what is it? Did you still just want to control him? Because that's what I took from that. You just wanted to control him. And you get to book him as you want. And maybe that would have moved Hogan down the card. Probably not. And that comes back into play. Oh, and I don't want to miss this. The sexual harassment with Rita Chatterton, which, as they tell in the documentary, when it happened, she is villainized for it. And then the most damning line to me in the documentary is Vince saying, well, it was consensual. But if it was rape, the statute of limitations had run out. But it was consensual. Wait, what? If it was rape, the statute of limitations ran out? Did you just use that as an excuse? You're not a lawyer. You're a human being. A lawyer can say that, and it's still scummy, but sure. That's the letter of the law, which, by the way, as we found out at the end of that episode, those had been lifted in New York, and he had to pay her, just like he had to pay other people. Amazingly. I was in clips from yesterday, and I saw other people posting stuff, and I'm like, wow, that tidbit's wrong about that. I think I talked about Owen with somebody yesterday. Well, actually, that blood was some of the Brood thing. I had discussions yesterday about why continuing on after Owen Hart died was wrong, and continuing on after Owen Hart died shouldn't have happened. I can't put myself in anyone's shoes from back then. But I can tell you that if I was Vince McMahon in 2021 talking about the night Owen Hart died and whether I was right or wrong or what decision I could have made in hindsight, I'll tell you what I wouldn't have said. I wouldn't have said I have no regrets about the situation, and I would have continued the show again. Are you fucking kidding me, dude? The guy talks about, well, I'm saying one thing and I'm thinking one thing, and then another thing I'm thinking about sex. Like, hey, use one of those brains to say the right fucking thing. No, the show shouldn't have gone on. They showed the promo. Dennis just mentioned it. They showed the promo when they cut away from ringside of Jeff Jarrett sending well wishes while in character to his best friend, Deborah, who's wearing like no clothes, which is fine. That was part of it. I get it. But she's like, you could tell she's out of it. She's wearing what she's wearing. And she is upset, and they're trying to stay in character. And there she is crying, wearing a half jacket and a bra and underwear. And you're trying to tell me this is still the show? When you have a chance, if you can handle it, because it is a lot. The second episode of Jeff Jarrett's podcast, My World, tells that entire story. It is heavy. It tells the story of Jeff losing his friend, the relationship they had, how it affected Jeff for years after that. And I know Jeff has revealed this, so I can say it. In Jeff's house, there is a memorial of sorts, a picture frame about Owen. So when I watched my now friend have to deliver that promo, a man who grew up in the business, whose grandmother promoted the business and has to fight through it. And then all these years later, Vince goes, I don't regret it. Fuck you, dude. Fuck you. For what? You know why? You know why that show continued? Because it was still under Vince's control. There was an In Your House, I want to say in 96. It's called In Your House, Beware a Dog. You guys, some of you might know this story. And there was massive weather in the area. Stone Cold is wrestling Savio Vega in a Caribbean strap match. And they have to wrestle in the dark. And the show gets messed up, and they have to come back a couple days later and do the pay-per-view. And they basically spliced it into 2 pay-per-views. They didn't have a choice because of the weather. Mother Nature said, no In Your House, Beware of Dog tonight. It ain't happening. 2 years later, 3 years later, whatever it was, with a couple of matches left on that card, including Stone Cold and The Undertaker, they kept the show going because Vince was in control. They could have stopped that show. They could have done that match whenever they needed to. It didn't matter. The fact that I'm even talking about it when they could figure it out, who cares? A man died in the ring in front of the crowd. And you have your commentators tell the world that. You have his best friend cut a promo as he's getting wheeled by him. And all these years later, you say you don't have any regrets. Fuck you. And I say that as someone who now feels more ashamed that I got checks from that guy. We all knew that there was shit in the past. I will tell you there were times where I felt uncomfortable working there. I will tell you there was times when I felt bad and gross promoting Saudi Arabia stuff. Not even the fact that like stuff was happening there. There were lines that we had to like read, and talking up the progressiveness of Saudi Arabia. Like, I will admit that some of those times were tough. I will admit that, with a lot of things that were heated on in the world, and I knew people believed in some bad shit at the top, that it felt icky. It felt gross to work there. I don't think I've ever felt the way I did when I heard those words out of Vince about Owen and not canceling the show. Holy shit, if even if you think you should have continued, you don't have to say it. Use one of those 9 brains you have working to shut the fuck up. Dennis, I'm reading that there. You said your younger brother was at that show in high school and just being there affected him for years. I can't imagine that. And I'm sorry he had to go through that. I know how much that haunted people. And you mentioned the people that didn't even know him. Think about the people that Jeff Jarrett and Deborah, and Owen was beloved. Brett tells the story. He felt it. Holy shit. I mean, they got sued. Wrongful death and, settlements and all this stuff. And years later, he goes, I don't have any regrets about continuing on with the show because that's what I would have wanted. Yeah, you're not a fucking human. And, there's that. There's also him whining about, think about that. The show must go on. But let me whine about the fact that some guy signed people that were not under contract anymore. The man needed control. Always wanted control. And would bitch and complain and fight and get angry if he didn't have that control. We watched 6 episodes of someone who is so emotionally, mentally, intellectually unstable that I am still amazed that people, while not as many, back him up. And I get that he's helped people along the way. That doesn't mean that supersedes the bad shit that he did. I think too often people use the crutch of, well, treated me okay. Sure. I'm sure Hitler treated some of his soldiers okay. I'm sure there's been plenty of terrible people in the world that have treated the ones around them okay. Doesn't make them okay. I know there are certain wrestlers who have done terrible things with sexual misconduct, and you still see them on TV every week. But if they donate enough money to some wrestlers' GoFundMe, well, they're up. There he is again. What a good guy. No. Dennis says, one of the reasons I'm happy Tony Khan lets Martha go out and give her awkward speeches. Nights that her and Oj can have some good moments with the business. Tony's a good guy that way. That's why I think I've gotten more angry about that. Not because I need to defend Tony Khan. He's a billionaire. He'll be fine. But the vitriol he gets for nothing in the big picture. If you don't like his booking decisions, okay, fine. But the amount of money and the amount of content that is made with such anger towards him is wild to me. And maybe he's an easy target. But he has done a lot of good in wrestling. He's done far more good in wrestling than bad. And that goes beyond booking. the screw jobs are a great example of Vince versus Tony. Wendy Richter gets screwed. She's a huge part of WrestleMania, and Cyndi Lauper. She wanted more money. They didn't want to pay her. She told stories of how she wasn't getting paid as much as opening match guys, even though she was a bigger star. Hell, that battle went on for years. So what do? They screw jobbed her. Brett. I understand the gray area of that one, admittedly. It's still Vince's company. He gets to make the call. But there was ways out of that. I think they booked themselves into a corner. That's the biggest. That is why it's on Vince, because he booked himself into a corner. And the only way he could book himself out was by fucking over Bret Hart. I think that's what bothers me the most about that. It was Vince's fault. Don't book it if you don't have a finish. Don't book it if you don't know where you're going. That's on you. And instead, what happens? You do that, and Vince ends up profiting off it because he becomes the guy that we saw on that night. The challenge, the changing sides, the first 3 episodes painted a picture of a man who whined when he didn't get his way. But if he used the same tactics, it was okay. He's got a double standard. He needs control. He's always needed control. When we get into the next couple episodes, we talk about Attitude Era, the family stuff, and of course the final episode where more comes out. I'll gather that many more thoughts. We'll get to that next week. I appreciate you guys being here for this. I enjoy being honest about this stuff, and I appreciate all the comments back to you, to me, as we talk more about it. We will do part 2 of this next week. I'll have an announcement about that probably early next week. But stay tuned for more. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being with me as a Matt member. Always appreciate your support. For the members out there that are watching, you get the live taping tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern. And I will be there for you then. And if you don't catch it then, it'll be on normally at 1 Eastern. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a great night. I'll see you tomorrow. My initial thoughts on the documentary, as I started to take them in episode by episode, was I know all this stuff, or I know almost all this stuff. Not that I paid less attention, but I would hear stuff. I'm going, oh, what are we going to uncover? What are we going to uncover? What's going to come out of this? Some things came out. I think Vince's quotes, the way he spoke, more than anything else, his demeanor, his lack of remorse. The interviews that were conducted with Vince specifically all happened before everything came out. And as it was noted in the documentary, he canceled final interviews. I'm not going to tell you that Vince would have known or should have known that there was a chance things could come out or anything like that. But I think it was telling that Bill Simmons and Ringer, who, produced this thing, and David Shoemaker, who was part of it, said it was very odd dealing with Vince. And he had, people there reminding him of the past. And while he was open to doing it and wanting to tell his story, like, he didn't understand how that would work. And if you listen to that and hear that, it's like, well, how would he not know it works? Like, doesn't he understand what the documentary is? And then I went, oh, use Vince brain here, which, believe me, we learned way too much about in this 6-part documentary series. Vince brain is, I get to control everything. Vince brain is not retrospective. When they were doing interviews, I believe, for The Last Ride, if I believe this is correct, The Last Ride was done in-house. The Last Ride was a WWE documentary. As far as I know, the guy who runs the docs, the VP of documentaries, did those interviews because it was Vince. Vince does not like to talk about the past. Vince does not like to talk about himself. When they're telling your story, that's what you have to do. And in the probably saddest, simplest way, hearing that, he didn't know what this would entail and he had to be reminded of stuff of the past. And I was like, oh, that does sound like Vince. That sounds like every story I've heard about the mentality of Vince. It's very much, well, wait, what do you mean we're doing it a different way? Where he's talking about Sable and people correct him, and one of the people off camera correcting him is Paul Heyman. So here's what you're not going to hear. As far as I know, Paul Heyman was interviewed for this in the building I worked in. I could be wrong about that, but he came in. It might have been for some other doc. But he was in, and he was in the same, more than a few people came in that building. And they shot a lot of stuff there. Netflix shot stuff there for Vince. WWE, I sat in that very same room. It's called Squash Alley. Originally, there was not a ring in there. They put a ring in there for Vince, and it just remained in there. I shot episodes of This Is Awesome there. Things we did for the bump were in there. There was an up, down, down WWE 2K ratings reveal there. So it did become a backdrop for documentary. So I know, like, Heyman had come through the building, but I knew Vince was there. I had heard there might have been crossover or something like that, and it didn't look like, based on what we saw in the documentary, that where Vince had his interviews done in that ring at the digital building, it didn't look like him and Heyman were in the same place. Unless they tried, and believe me, you can make things look like whatever you want, wherever you want them to be, and people have no idea. But it looked like Heyman's was done somewhere else. But Vince was in that room. And I'm not surprised that he had his people with him. And I wasn't surprised to hear, well, he would push the time back and we would just be waiting around for ETAs. Ask anybody who was on the writing team with Vince. That was life. That's why that job under Vince did not have a long shelf life. People would hang in there for a year, maybe, and move on or get fired or what. It was too chaotic. It was too all over the place. It wasn't. Vince gets a lot of credit for being a wrestling genius. To me, he was, for a time, a wrestling genius. He will go down as the greatest promoter of all time. And that's all I'm going to speak on as it relates to him as a wrestling pro. I'm just limiting it to him being a promoter. I'm not talking about the human being or things he did along the way. But as time went on, and I had heard this, that when WWE went public, Vince's mindset changed. Now, WWE went public, as we know, not that long after the purchase of WCW. And that was the whole thing with Austin's last match. We don't want to tell anybody because we're going public and all. And not surprisingly, creative started to go downhill. But I was told by someone who had been there for quite some time, who had worked under multiple eras of the company and under Vince, he started, all the micromanaging really began when the company went public because he felt that it fell on him. And I can respect that. I can respect that thought process as a businessman. Do I completely believe it? No. I think he did want to put his fist down on things. I think with more shows, because then at that point you're a couple of years into Raw and SmackDown, 4 hours of television a week, Heat's 5. Obviously, it would grow. And they had the brand split and all that stuff, but he's very much still in it as obviously the owner of the company and the booker of the company and all of the hats he wore, but he was also a performer. Hey, this is Matt Camp. Thanks for checking out one of our recent clips from the Wrestling Mat. Why is someone so close to The Rock kind of throwing Cody under the bus?
Yeah, a lot of people won't engage with Jim Cornette. I did, just because I have a mark for Jim Cornette.
Please subscribe right now. Hit the like and turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing. And I think you should listen to your TV partners. Let me tell you about WWE and a little insight. More subscribers means more content. And make sure you follow us on social media at WrestlingMat23 on both Twitter and Instagram.